All right, let's go ahead and get started. So once again, my name is Ian Wallace, and welcome everybody back to the second talk in the Fall Colloquium series in the Department of Anthropology at the University of New Mexico. Today, we're really excited to have a speaker from our own department share some recent adventures of hers. And I'm going to let her advisor, 𝗦𝗲𝗍𝗵𝗿𝗀 introduce her. So we're really fortunate to have somebody from our own community here speaking with us today. So again, I'm just going to remind everybody, if you're not speaking, if you could turn off your camera because it will make the Zoom recording a bit better. All right, Melissa.
Thanks, Ian. So as you may have heard last time, Ian and Josh and Michael, the colloquium committee, have really developed a really nice program this year in order to highlight speakers from within our community and try to facilitate building more of a community. And what we're doing today is a little different, and this idea actually came from Stephanie, which is to try to feature people who've been to the field and who've had these life-changing experiences and who come back to UNM, maybe not knowing everybody anymore. And so this is a way to reintroduce Stephanie to new students, to other folks that she may not have met before. And these welcome back talks are no data, so it's not exactly a science talk, but it's more about the different kinds of experiences that our students are engaging in as part of their PhD. So with that in mind, we hope that this will be the first in kind of a tradition of doing this. And so if there's anybody else that has recently returned from the field who wants to volunteer, Stephanie was kind enough here to be our guinea pig for this little experiment. So Stephanie Fox came to us from, by way of the University of Toronto and the University of Calgary. She's Canadian through and through. And she has previously done research in Ghana on colobus monkeys and has just returned from Uganda, where she did about a year of field work. She was able to get back home on what was officially, I think, the last flight out of Uganda once the quarantine hit. So Stephanie's work has been funded by the 𝗭𝗍𝗵𝗿𝗀 Foundation, by the 𝗦𝗲𝗍𝗵𝗿𝗀 Foundation, as well as by graduate studies here at UNM. And I think that Stephanie's pretty good at introducing herself, so I will pass it on to her.
Thanks, Melissa. And thanks for a great introduction on this speaker series. I am really excited for it. So let me just get my screen sharing up here. Okay. Hopefully everybody can see my screen now. All right, so my name is Stephanie. Thanks for the introduction. And I'm a fifth-year PhD student now. Hard to believe, but I am going into my fifth year now. And I came back from conducting my field research in Uganda, where I study social relationships in female chimpanzees. And so, like Melissa mentioned, this is going to be a no data talk. So I am mostly going to be talking to you about what I hoped to achieve in the field, and also what it is sort of like to be in the field doing chimp research. So I'm going to start with an introduction to my research, and then I'm going to give you what I hope is sort of a full picture of life in the field. I'm going to talk very briefly about some of my what I call research feelings, because I haven't analyzed my data, so I don't have research findings yet. But there's some anecdotes that I want to share about what I hope to find in my data. And then I'm going to talk really briefly about some of the ways that I was able to get involved in the local community outside of the field station and outside of the park where I was working. Next, there we go. All right, so why do I study female chimpanzees? So I want to take a step back first and talk about some of the really big research questions that motivate my research. So I'm interested in big questions like, why do animals form social bonds? And why do some individuals form stronger social bonds than others? I'm also interested in how animals change their social strategies as the costs and benefits of their social relationships change over the course of their life. And these questions are big research questions that many biologists who are studying social animals are interested in. But I'm an evolutionary anthropologist, so I'm specifically interested in these questions as a way of trying to understand humans and the evolution of human behavior as a social species. And one way we can do that is by examining these questions in our closest living relative, the chimpanzee, who we hope will give us some insight into human evolution. And, oh, too far. There we go. Why am I specifically interested in female chimps? So I'm interested in female chimps because historically, male chimpanzees have been studied quite extensively, for one. So male chimpanzees have very complicated social relationships, and we know quite a bit about them, but there's still a lot to learn. But females, on the other hand, have historically been represented as sort of having uninteresting and unimportant social relationships. And so we have a lot to learn about them as we start to overturn that idea. So I want to read to you this quote that Richard Wrangham wrote in 1980, where he says, "Social relationships among different females are uniformly unimportant and undifferentiated. There's very little female-female grooming. Rates of aggression are low. Coalitionary alliances are rare. And dominance relationships are unstable and difficult to detect." And some of this, so let me preface this by saying he wasn't actually talking about chimpanzees, female chimpanzees specifically in this quote. He was talking about species like chimpanzees. And so and this was based on some of his own experiences studying chimpanzees. So indirectly, he was talking about chimpanzees. But interestingly, some parts of this statement have actually been overturned since he wrote it in 1980. So, for example, we know now that female chimpanzees' social relationships are not undifferentiated. Females actually do form social preferences, and sometimes those social preferences are very strong. We also have very good evidence of dominance relationships now. So it's not only that they were detectable, though, it's also that those relationships are actually quite stable. And so over time, we've started to sort of understand that perhaps female chimpanzees have a much more complicated social life than we initially thought. On top of that, here, Richard writes that these relationships are unimportant, but at the time, there wasn't actually evidence of that, say, a hypothesis that they're not biologically important. But it's a big question that needs investigating, and it's not something, it's something that's sort of been overlooked in the last couple of decades, but we're starting to think that if social relationships are differentiated and they are stable over time, they might also have some value. Now, it is true that females don't groom very often, rates of aggression are low, and coalitionary alliances are rare, but it doesn't necessarily mean that these relationships are unimportant. It's possible that even though these relationships are rare or weak, they might have some value. So that's a big motivation for my dissertation, is to try and understand whether or not these relationships might impact a female's ability, for example, to access food resources, which might impact her ability to reproduce or the speed at which she reproduces. And she might also, her social relationships might also impact, for example, the development and success of her offspring. So there's a lot to investigate, and this is sort of the backbone of my dissertation. Some of the questions that I'm interested in are, do females form coalitions more with preferred social partners? So if that were true, that would mean that females are forming that the value of that there is value to forming a social bond because they're able to form a coalition more reliably or more comfortably with that certain individual. It's also possible, or I'm interested in considering whether or not females change their social behavior to accommodate the social needs of their offspring, which would indicate perhaps that these social relationships are important for impacting their offspring's success. And then, because I'm interested not only in whether or not females are forming social relationships, I'm interested in why, if females are not always forming strong social bonds, why are some individuals not doing that if there is a benefit to that social relationship? So I'm interested in whether or not females are perhaps less social when they are energetically constrained, and also the possibility that males, through male aggression, actually impede social interaction. So, so these are some of the questions in my dissertation. I am extremely fortunate to work with the 𝗭𝗶𝗄𝗆 Chimpanzee Project for my research. And so this project was started in 1987 by Richard Wrangham in 𝗭𝗶𝗄𝗆 National Park in Uganda. And so that means that the community of chimpanzees that I study has been observed for over 30 years now. So they've been followed regularly by humans, and they are very habituated to human presence. All of the research that we do is non-invasive, so we're never touching the chimps. We're never interacting with the chimps. They're just used to us being there, and they ignore our presence. So we get really high quality data. Also, there's a wealth of long-term data on the individuals that I study. So I'll also be able to use that data to answer some of the questions in my dissertation, in addition to the data that I've collected in the last year. The field site is in Uganda. So 𝗭𝗶𝗄𝗆 National Park is on the west side of Uganda. Let me see if I can get a laser pointer here. Okay, so here we go. So 𝗭𝗶𝗄𝗆 National Park is over here on the west side of Uganda. If we zoom in, this is what people refer to as the Dragon Head. It's 𝗭𝗶𝗄𝗆 National Park. And our field station is on the edge of the park, somewhere just around here. All right, so let's talk briefly about what it is like to actually be in the field studying chimps. So I go out every day that I go into the forest. I leave the house at about 5:30 in the morning. We go out in the dark and we hike out to where the chimps are known to have nested the night before. And then we sit under their nest and we wait for the chimps to come out of their nest. And then we follow those chimps all day. And I worked with the 𝗭𝗶𝗄𝗆 Chimpanzee Project field assistants, some of whom have been following chimpanzees for, I think, 13 years is the most. So they're really, really experienced and very good at understanding chimp behavior and also chimp movements. And it's very helpful for trying to keep track of the chimps all day long, because sometimes they move very quickly and it's difficult to keep up with them. So there's an extensive trail system. We do use the trail system, but the chimps also don't use the trail system sometimes, or go to areas where there are no trails. So you also spend a lot of the day bushwhacking through the forest. We can hike anywhere from 5 to 23 kilometers per day. That also can involve something like, oh, let me get this laser pointer off of there, there we go. That can also involve something like 300 to 1,000 meters of elevation gain in a day. So I worked every day with my field assistant, Natalia, who is from Colombia, and she was able to come and work for me thanks to the funding, the grants that I received, which we were able to use to cover the cost of her travel and having her live there. And she was completely indispensable to my research, not just because she motivated me and kept me sane every day, but also she doubled the amount of data that I was able to collect. So the way that we worked together was that I followed an adult female, and at the same time that I was collecting and recording data on that adult female, 𝗤𝗏𝗏 would follow that adult female's infant. So we have this paired data set on simultaneous behavior between an adult female and her infant. That's really detailed, and that had never been done before, and is a data set that I'm really looking forward to being able to investigate, particularly for questions about the impact of adult female social interactions and social behavior on the social world of their offspring. In addition to that, having 𝗤𝗏𝗏 was just incredible for the quality of the data, because being able to have two sets of eyes on sort of the little world that we were trying to record information on was really, really helpful. So we were there from about March 2019 to March 2020. Like Melissa said, it was actually the second last flight out of Uganda that I came home on. But we were in the forest for about 200 days over that year. And during that time, I collected about 700 hours of focal data. There's 19 adult females that I followed, and 𝗤𝗏𝗏 collected about 450 hours of data on 14 infants. So it's a really great data set that we were able to put together. While you're in the forest, there is an incredible abundance of biodiversity that you can also enjoy every day. And so these photos are actually all taken at the field station, literally beside my house. And these are some of the primate species that would come by regularly. There's also several ungulate species that you would see. The one in the upper right here is a bushbuck. Anyways, there's an incredible diversity of mammals. So there's 12 primate species, I believe, several species of ungulate. We also saw giant forest hogs, there's elephants, there's cool mongoose to see. And if you're just not in luck and not seeing any mammals that day, literally every day you could just look down around you and see some very cool bugs. Honestly, they're like, it's ridiculous. I think every single day I was in the forest, I saw at least one cool bug. And most days I saw a bug that I had never seen before. So that just gives you an idea of like the abundance of biodiversity. Not everything in the forest was always peachy. There's a few challenges. So one of the major things that we deal with is swamps. The chimps are very agile and can move through swamps like pretty quickly. We try and follow them. We often sink into the mud, or you get kind of good at it after a while, but still some areas of the forest are very difficult to move through. So on the left here, this is a photo of me being pulled out. I was stuck in over my knees in a swamp, both legs stuck in, and two field assistants actually had to pull me out. That's how stuck I was. Over here, 𝗤𝗏𝗏 on the right, this is 𝗤𝗏𝗏 stuck in up to her waist in a swamp, which remarkably she was actually able to get out of by herself while I laughed at her. And this photo is 𝗤𝗏𝗏 stuck in, it rained a lot, so we were often in our ponchos and our raincoats. The year that we were there was one of the highest rain years on record. It wasn't record breaking, but it was one of the couple of decades. Which, you know, it's actually quite cold when it rains. So we were cold and wet a lot of the year, which kind of does, you know, grate on you after a while, but you know, just requires a lot of persistence to keep collecting data in those circumstances. And then this here is a video, which hopefully will go to show you our other, I mean, friend slash enemy in the forest, the elephant, who are very dangerous to researchers. Getting charged by an elephant is a real risk. But I was never charged by an elephant, and I did get this one clip of an elephant passing by peacefully. Most of the time we just hear them and we avoid them. Things are not always peachy in the forest for chimpanzees either. This is a photo of 𝗤𝗏𝗏 on the right. She was a subadult/adult female. And she, you can see on her wrist here, she has a wire snare that has been pulled tight. This is the wire here that has been pulled tight on her wrist. The snares in the forest are not really intended for chimpanzees. Poachers are usually trying to poach other animals for bush meat for eating, like the ungulate species, for example, but then chimps occasionally get caught in the snares and rip them out of the ground and then carry them around So you can see that this is pulled tight on her wrist and it's causing her hand to swell up. You can also see she doesn't have any fingers because she had previously had a snare injury where she lost those fingers. However, the 𝗭𝗵𝗿𝗁 Chimpanzee Project now has a vet on staff, and if there's a snare event, they will try to dart the individual depending on the circumstances if it's safe. In this case, we were able to successfully dart 𝗦𝗲𝗽𝗁 and remove the snare. And I was there for that. It was really, really cool to watch the vets. They were, and the field assistants who were very helpful. They were amazing at their jobs. And even cooler was watching 𝗦𝗲𝗽𝗁 heal over the coming weeks. She healed compared to a human, like remarkably quickly, and was actually using that hand again in the couple of weeks after that event. So I want to give you an idea of what it's like to live at the field station. I think it's extremely cushy compared to other field stations that I have lived at before. So I had a house. This on the right shows you the inside of my house. I think it was very lovely. There are, of course, a few pests that, you know, you are at a field station. So from time to time, you do get your toes nibbled, maybe while you're working at your desk, maybe while you're in your bed. But I think it's a low cost to pay. I also want to talk a little bit about the food, because I often get comments from people about how, you know, I must only eat beans and rice, and do I even get enough nutrients, and you know, other comments that I'm like, gosh, you have no idea. We eat like kings and queens. I have no complaints about the food. So I started to document the food because people were wondering what on earth I ate. And honestly, we ate such a wild array of foods. This is a pizza here on the left with caramelized onion and goat cheese from a local goat farm, Huevos Rancheros. We got our cook to make us churros one day. They don't look like churros, but they tasted great. We had tacos regularly. This was an Indian food night with homemade saag paneer, with the paneer made from dairy from a local farm. The fruit is amazing. We had passion fruit juice regularly. This was a Mediterranean night. This was a lentil nut loaf that we made for Thanksgiving, homemade veggie burgers and Caesar salad. And this is a like spicy noodle, spicy sort of Asian style noodle bowl. So an abundance of excellent food. All right, I want to give you a little bit of an idea of my research feelings so far. I'll first mention that, so when Natalia and I collected data, we would often voice record our data. And that enabled us to collect a really intense sort of density of data, so rapid fire that it's faster than we would have been able to type. And so we just voice record it. But like I said, I collected about 700 hours of data. So that's 700 hours or so of voice recordings that need to be transcribed, which turns into like a 6-month full-time job, at least for myself. So instead, I some people at the field station to transcribe some of that data for me. And so here we have Robina sitting on the left. We used iPods, there's an app that you can use. I programmed the app to have all of our data codes in it. And they listen to the files, they transcribe them on the iPod, and then they download the files off the iPod onto a computer, and then can look at those files in Excel and clean up any mistakes. So it's a lot of work, but and that's why, you know, I came back from the field in March, and lots of people ask me like, are you analyzing your data yet? And when are you going to write your dissertation? And I have to explain that it's probably going to be several months until my data is finished being transcribed and cleaned. And also because of COVID, data transcription was halted for a while, but they actually just went back to work a couple of weeks ago. So in terms of research feelings, I just have a couple of photos and a couple of anecdotes that I want to share with you. So if you remember, I was interested in whether or not females might change their social behavior to benefit their offspring, and whether or not their social relationships are important for their offspring's social development. So this is a photo. You're looking at an adult female named Special who is lying on her back. And on her stomach is her newborn baby, who's just a couple of weeks old at this point, who's resting on her stomach there. And then there's two infants who are actually both grooming, her infant. So this is 𝗦𝗲𝗿𝗁 here, who is the son of an adult female that Special often hangs out with. And this is Stella over here. Stella is Special's daughter, her older daughter. So both of these infants are here grooming 𝗬𝗍, Special's little baby. And I just like how it illustrates sort of the social world of the infant. Yes, the mother is very important, her siblings are important, but other infants also interact with the infant, 𝗬𝗍. And so I just kind of like how it illustrates that indeed, like this female hanging out with her friend, 𝗦𝗲𝗿𝗁, 𝗦𝗲𝗍's mom, 𝗦𝗲𝗿, and it's probably important for her infant's upbringing because it gives her infants more social opportunities. So I think that is something that will come out of my data, at least being able to illustrate that females, that infants do benefit or gain more social opportunities when their mothers are being more social. It's intuitive, right? I also want to share with you a particular story about my two favorite females, Delta and 𝗏𝗏𝗏, because they formed a very interesting and significant and strong social relationship while I was in the field. So like I said, like I said earlier, most female chimpanzees don't form strong relationship. It's a rare thing that this happens. But if you ask most researchers who've been at our site, they think they've all observed a very strong relationship between two females. So they do happen regularly. So Delta here is on the right and 𝗏𝗏𝗏 is on the left, and they formed a very strong social relationship. And what indicated the strength of their relationship to me was a few things. So in this photo, they are high arm grooming, where they have their hands clasped together at the top, and then they're each using their free hand to sort of simultaneously groom each other. And high arm grooming, it doesn't necessarily indicate a strong bond, but I have to say that I did not see high arm grooming, which is an intimate form of grooming, between any other pair of unrelated females. I saw it between sisters, I saw it between moms and daughters, but Delta and 𝗏𝗏𝗏 regularly high arm groomed with each other. On top of that, they were seen together almost always. So we kind of had a bet going whether or not, if you saw Delta, did you see 𝗏𝗏𝗏 too? Yes, they were often almost attached at the hip. They were within 5 meters of each other for days on end. And on top of that, they groomed each other pretty much every day. So we had a bet going, I think for about 1 month, every single time that we saw Delta and 𝗏𝗏𝗏, we saw them groom each other, which is just really, really rare among females. Then on top of that, on a number of occasions, we saw Delta or 𝗏𝗏𝗏 form day nests. So often during the day, if a chimp wants to take a nap, they might form a nest. They build a nest up in a tree and take a nap. And sometimes Delta and 𝗏𝗏𝗏 would nap in the same nest together. And if they didn't nest in the same nest together, they might build nests about 4 or 5 meters apart. And after they're done napping, one might go and climb into the other's nest and then start grooming with her. And on top of that, I also saw them form a number of coalitions together. In a relatively short period of time, about 1 month, I think I saw them form like 3 or 4 coalitions together, which is a very high rate of coalition formation between females. So they would do joint displays together, where they would run down a pathway, for example, slapping the ground and pant-hooting. They also chased and attacked other females, even threw other females out of feeding trees so that they would have the feeding tree to themselves. So there was a lot of evidence that this was a very strong social relationship. And in this photo, I particularly like this photo because you can also see that each of them has a young infant in their lap. And these young infants were born about a month apart. And I didn't really see Delta and Tripoli very much before they had these infants. So I'm not sure how strong their social relationship was before that, but it seemed to me that it definitely was very strong after these infants were born. So I'm going to come back to the idea of infants, but it did seem to me like maybe having these infants was part of the sort of the backbone of their relationship. So I have a few videos for you here. Let's see if I can put into play. So I just have a video here on the left. This is just showing you. In this video. There we go. I'm going to turn the volume down so I can talk at the same time. So here we have a group of females who are all grooming together with their infants or their offspring, their older offspring, which is just a nice video of a big cluster of females grooming. It is rare, but I do want to illustrate that it does occur. And then in this video on the right, we know that coalitions are very rare between females, and on top of that, they're very difficult to film because you're never 100% sure when they're about to happen. But I did get this clip where, so this is Delta sitting here on the left, or sorry, this is Tripoli sitting here on the left, and this is Delta on the right. And what I want you to look for in the video is right at the beginning of the video, there's a subadult male who's over here, who's coming towards them, and he's going to start displaying at them. And right as soon as he starts coming towards them, Delta and Tripoli reach out their arms to each other, and they sort of reassure each other before Delta attacks it and chases off 𝗦𝗲𝗍, the subadult male who comes displaying at them. So have a look, and that touching of arms, that reassurance, I think is a kind of a beautiful indication of their friendship. Okay, so I said I was going to come back to the importance of infants. And in this photo, you're looking at Tripoli here and her son, 𝗵𝗵, and then Delta is on the right grooming Tripoli. So Delta, her infant Dolly died around the end of January. And it was really, really interesting to me to watch how their relationship changed after the death of Dolly. There's a few things that happened. First of all, in the 2 weeks after that, I watched Delta groom Tripoli a lot, but Tripoli barely groomed Delta back. It seemed like very suddenly their relationship became very unequal. And maybe another week after that, Delta started cycling again. So she returned to estrus, meaning she was receptive to mating with males. She had a sexual swelling, if you're familiar with that. So she became very interested in mating with males and spending a lot of time around the males. And suddenly this extraordinary social bond that I had been observing for a few months had totally waned. It was suddenly non-existent. They weren't together anymore. They weren't grooming when they were together. So maybe they were a little bit more tolerant of each other still, but there wasn't any nesting together or coalitions and barely any grooming. So this is an anecdote. I don't know that it was the presence of infants that really drove this relationship or broke this relationship, but it's certainly something that I'm really interested in investigating in the long-term data to see if we have other examples of this. And also looking generally at whether or not females sort of form or dissolve relationships as their infants sort of are born and mature. Okay, so the last thing I want to talk about is some of the ways that I got involved with the community outside of the field station. And I'll preface this by saying that the field station where I was, it's kind of like living in a compound. So there's houses in there, but only researchers really live in there. And the employees from the local community come in, work, and then leave. And other community members don't really have any reason to go into the field station. So there becomes like a bit of a barrier between interaction with the community. I wasn't really, walking through the village or buying things from people there very often. So there's not very much interaction unless you make an effort to do that. So I was like quite keen to, for example, visit our field assistants, and I was really fortunate to be invited over to many of their houses for dinner. I also went to a local festival that this is showing you a dance competition from that festival. So there was several dance groups like from the immediate area outside of the field station who were having a competition. There was also a fashion show at the event, and it was really cool to watch the local dance groups. Sorry, there we go. At some point early on while I was there, I also ended up getting involved in organizing a March for Science at the field station. And it came about because the field assistants and I were talking about participating in the March for Science, the global March for Science, by taking some photos with our signs in the forest and then maybe posting them to social media. But the field assistants were the ones actually who said, I really think this would be a more beneficial activity if we involved the community. And in a matter of days, it just grew and grew, and suddenly we had 80 students coming from the local community. They were coming to the field station where we met up with over 15 representatives from the Uganda Wildlife Authority and over 20 field assistants who represented all of the projects from the from all of the research projects that were going on in the field station at the time. And we marched, we all made signs, and then we marched through the local community back to the field station. And at the field station, the students also had time to interact with the field assistants from the research projects and ask questions and talk in their own local language about science and about the animals that these people studied and the types of research questions that they were trying to answer. In the bottom right here is also a photo of myself and our field assistant, 𝗖𝗍. We were invited to go and speak on the local public radio about the march, advertising the march, but also talking about the importance of conservation. So that was very cool. I was told, by the way, like people were thrilled about this event, and I was told that it was the first event of its kind in that area. And the last thing I'll mention is that Natalia and I were also extremely fortunate to get to go to a conference while we were in the field, which is kind of unexpected. But the African Primatological is actually having their second in the city of Entebbe, which is about a 6-hour drive from where we were at the field station. So we went down for a few days, and it was Natalia's first ever conference. I was able to give a talk on some of the research from 𝗭𝗵𝗿𝐻 project. And I also, it was very cool to listen to talks from a whole variety of researchers who study primates in Africa, but don't usually make it all the way to North America for any of the conferences that I usually attend over here. So it was really inspiring to hear about all of this research that I just didn't even know was going on. It was very cool. All right, so I will, hopefully there's enough time for questions. And I welcome questions from everybody, especially community members and undergraduates who maybe are not as familiar with this type of research. Please ask questions. And yeah, I'd like to thank all of these groups that enabled my research and funding resources. Thank you. I'm going to end screen sharing. Let's
Clapping
see.
on behalf of everyone. That was really wonderful, Stephanie. Thank you.
Yeah, my pleasure.
So yeah, if you all want to ask questions in the chat, you can do it that way, or you're welcome to turn on your camera and ask a question if you want to do it that way as well. Well, if nobody has a question, I actually have a question. I was curious about the hypothesis that you mentioned at the beginning about whether females are less social when they're energetically constrained. And I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit more about sort of your thinking about that hypothesis.
Yeah, sure. So that hypothesis is based on a bigger idea that is pretty well founded, that females, if there's a high competition for resources, basically, and those resources are sort of spread out across the environment, then they're not, if there's pressure to sort of, not be sitting beside your competitor while you eat, then you might be more likely to be more dispersed around the environment. And so you might not interact with those females as often. It's more complicated than that, but that's part of it. And so that also suggests that basically when feeding competition is higher, which would be when food resources are less available, females might be less likely to interact. And opposingly, when there's an abundance of food resources, it's much easier to sit beside your competitor and not be so stressed out about, the possibility of competing for this limited resource. And so that's sort of the backbone to that idea. And we're going to use hormones to address that, actually. So I didn't mention that we actually collect urine samples regularly while we're in the field. And it's very easy. We collect those samples non-invasively. So we, for example, if an individual is in a tree and they're urinating, we can either catch that on a piece of plastic, basically, and then pipette it off of the plastic, or if you're not there in time, you can also pipette it off the vegetation. So once you have that urine sample, they get frozen, they get shipped back here, and we can analyze those urine samples for a molecule that's called C-peptide, which relates to their glucose, their insulin levels, and their glucose balance. So it gives us an idea of the energetic balance of the individual. And so that's how I'm going to address that question. I'm going to look at energetic balance in individuals and their rates of social behavior.
Cool, thank you. That's great. You should have had more pictures of the pea collection. That would have been.
You know what? Now that you mention it, I'm like, how did I not have any pictures of pea collection? Honestly, it's because I don't think I have that many photos of it. You're like in the moment. You're running for pea. You're not taking photos.
Yeah. I see Christina has her hand raised.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Oh, I'm sorry, I've never used Zoom before. My question is regarding the term rare when you're discussing certain social behaviors. I noticed that you will use the phrase that certain activities are identified or you describe as rare, and I wonder, is there actually a definition as to how many constitutes rare, or for the purposes of research?
Yeah, that's a really, really good question, actually. So there's a few things that we do. So when I talk about the presence of strong social relationships, for example, being rare, one thing that's been done is that we take a bunch of measures of how individuals socialize with each other. And we condense that down into an index that basically says, like, this is sort of how strong their social relationship is. And then you can graph those. And you can graph how many individuals have sort of a low level relationship, how many have this sort of medium level relationship, and how many have a very strong relationship. And so what you see is in females, you would see a graph where that low end has very high bars. Most of the dyads, the pairs that we analyze, have very low level interaction rates. and a very few number of individuals have very strong relationships. And then we could do things like, for example, compare that to male chimpanzees and put them on the same graph and see that maybe more male chimpanzees have relationships at the higher end. In terms of defining whether or not those relationships are rare, there's statistical ways you could do that. Like you could say, you know, I'm going to put this on a curve, and we're going to say that if you are like 2 standard deviations above the mean, then we're going to call that a very strong relationship, and there's very few of them, we're going to call that rare. But that's sort of, people use different techniques to do that. In terms of actual behaviors, we would do something sort of similar. So, for example, if I look at the rate of coalitions between 2 females, so how often do 2 females form a coalition against another individual? And I could put that on a graph and see that, you know, very, very few. So like, for example, in a 1-year period or a 2-year period, I see a pair of females forms 10 coalitions, but the majority of female pairs form very few coalitions. So you have a huge number of zeros in the data set, and you have a few pairs of females that form coalitions regularly. So we call that rare. And again, you could statistically define that if you wanted to, but you don't have to necessarily.
Thank you.
Yes, Susan, I see, Suzanne, excuse me, I read it wrong. I see your hand up. Would you like to ask a question?
Yeah, thank you so much, Stephanie, for your talk. I'm wondering, since I work in forest too, but South American forest, how do you manage not to get lost while you're following these animals? I would never want to stray very far from anybody who knew the terrain, and you guys are just out there knee deep in mud and things. How do you manage that? How do you not get lost?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, for one, I mean, the field assistants, the 𝗭𝗶𝗄𝗆𝐵𝐵𝐺 Project field assistants, they know the forest really, really well. Although even then, from time to time, we do go really far. The chimps might take you to an area. I've been with the field assistants before where they say, I've never been here before, or I've been here once in the last decade. We do have a GPS, so that's sort of like your safety net, because, well, actually, I think we rely on them more. It's not even just a safety net. We rely on them a lot. For figuring out where we go. The trail map has been put onto our GPS system, which is wonderful. So you can sort of navigate that way. You also get a feel for it after a while. You get to know the different valleys. And so it's a very hilly terrain. You get to know different landmarks and swamps and stuff. And you get to know the best routes that are sort of like, how do I get home without going through the worst swamp, or which pathway has the least swamp on it? So there's a lot of sort of like knowledge that you build up, but ultimately, honestly, I would not want to be out there without my GPS. And we bring extra GPS batteries, you know, like that's my.
Well, that makes sense. I forgot about GPS.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks.
Yeah. Thanks for the question.
Steve Bishop.
So I was wondering if there are other people doing similar studies to what you're doing in the region, so that you can perhaps determine whether some of the behaviors are more the product of sort of like local culture as opposed to species specific behavior?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And there is actually. So for one, there's a neighboring project, which I can actually walk to from my field site. It's about 9 kilometers away. Called the 𝗭𝗭𝗿𝗁 Project, where they also study now what was one community of chimpanzees. It's split into 2 now. And they have a huge number of females in those communities. So there is another researcher over there who's also collecting data on that. And actually some of the research that I mentioned about, you know, the study that first showed that females do have differentiated social relationships, that actually came from 𝗭𝗭𝗿𝗁's research project. Then there's also, so that's one that happens to be very close. And so it is a great opportunity to ask whether or not there's sort of ecological variables that might be impacting their social behavior. So at that field site, we think they have higher food availability, for example. They have more older growth trees that produce more fruit. So that's one way that you could ask that question. I'll say sort of hypothetically in the long term, we could ask that question. It's not something that I'm currently engaged in. But then there's also other field sites that do have good data on this. So 𝗂𝗵𝗿, the field site where Jane Goodall worked, they have great data. So there's, but that's not in the same forest, but it would be a way of asking that kind of question. Yeah.
There's one message in the, or one question in the chat from Patricia. Will the March for Science become an annual event?
Oh, that's a great question. And I wish it would have if it weren't for COVID, but it was meant to be in April this year. So I don't know, maybe if future researchers wanted to pick it up, or if there's enough momentum that people at the field station, you know, did it on their own. But I suspect it would be if researchers in the future want to. I think there would be community support for it for sure. They would love it if it happened again. Yeah. And would probably grow even more.
Yeah, I'll just say I thought that the March for Science was pretty awesome. It was really remarkable to see that. Yeah, it's inspiring.
It was fantastic. I would add that, like, you know, I might have been sort of part of the catalyst for it, but honestly, I was just the structure in the end, because it grew on behalf of the community. Everybody was having ideas and how we could do this, and they just whipped it together so fast. Like out of nowhere, it was suddenly like, you know, 15 members from the Uganda Wildlife Authority will be here, including some very like high up people, and also they'd like us to speak on the radio station. I was just kind of like, oh my gosh, okay, sure, yeah. It was fantastic. It was really, really inspiring. Yeah.
Yeah, that's so cool. Anybody else have any other questions?
I have a question. Hey, it's Katie.
Okay.
Steph, will you talk a little bit more about your field assistant who was from Colombia? Maybe I missed it, but how did you come to find each other? And, you know, was she there with you the whole time and all that?
She was there with me almost the whole time. So she finished her undergraduate degree in May 2019. And the day after she wrote her last exam, she got on a plane and came to the field. And then was there with me for the rest of it. We found each other because I put a job posting up on a website that lots of primatologists use called Primate InfoNet. And she found it and she applied. And she had had experience before working in the field in the Amazon, which our field site is hard because of like elephants and swamps and hills and going far every day and going fast. But the Amazon has like way worse bugs. So I knew that she would be fine with like being in the rain, having scary bugs around, you know, stuff like that. So, and she had great references. So it worked out really, really well. Yeah. And she's still working for me, transcribing the data. And we're sort of like teaming up, helping her to put together applications for graduate school. So it's been all around a really good experience. Yeah.
That's cool. That's really cool. Thank you.
Yeah.
All right, if there are no other questions, we'll call it a day, and we'll once again thank you so much, Stephanie. That was really wonderful. The inaugural talk in the what will hopefully be a series of no data talks and reports on adventures. We are lucky to have a few more graduate students in the program speaking throughout the semester, so we look forward to those talks as well. So yes, same time, same place next week, and I hope to see you all there. But once again, Stephanie, thank you very much. That was really wonderful. Beautiful.
Yeah, thanks so much for hosting.
Pictures.
Oh, thanks. Thanks. Yeah, thanks so much everyone for coming. I'm so pleased to see people from all of the subfields. That's really, really nice. Yeah, thank you.